right, so last week we did, Bobby went through 2 Samuel 12 and 13, and just kind of a quick rehash. Chapter 12 dealt with the prophet Nathan uh, approaching um, approaching David, and basically about the incident with Bathsheba. And then in chapter 13, we see this horrible story where one of uh, David's sons, Amnon, is just infatuated with his stepsister Tamar and sets up this horrible scheme to uh, pretend he's sick and have her come in to attend to him. And he unfortunately rapes her. And and it's one of these hard situations where you really never see David deal with it. And Absalom, it was his full sister, and obviously Absalom is not happy at all with how things took place. And Absalom waited 2 years. He put a plan into place and waited 2 years and took an opportunity to have Amnon killed. And then Absalom quickly takes off and goes to this kingdom of Geshur, which his maternal grandfather is the king of Geshur. And so that ends up being kind of his safe place that he goes and is in exile. Chapter 14 starts off that we're seeing a guy named Joab, who's taken a big important place here. Joab is the nephew of David. Joab is also the chief leader of his army. Joab is obviously a close confidant of David's, in that when the whole incident with Uriah the Hittite was being played out, Joab was the person that David chose to have to go out and reach and talk to Joab and bring him in, and unfortunately have some things take place. And so Joab is at a point where the kingdom has just been brought back together. Yeah, Judah and Israel were fighting; they were apart. They've just now come together here, and now they've got a situation where Absalom has been basically kind of banished. He's far away, and Absalom is actually the next one in line to take over the kingdom when you look at this dynastic way that they handle things then. And so Joab just sees a very messy situation coming up if Absalom's banished and then David dies. And how do you keep these, Joab and Israel from going back at each other's throats again? And so chapter 14 starts. Now, Joab, son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart went out to Absalom. And Joab sent to Tekoa, a city, and brought from there a wise, crafty woman, and said to her, "Pretend to be a mourner, and put on garments. Do not anoint yourself with oil, but behave like a woman who has been mourning for many days for the dead. Go to the king and speak to him." So Joab put the words in her mouth. So Joab is coming up with the way to try to reach out to David. From this, we can sense that Joab has probably approached David about this and didn't get very far. And so no telling how many different plans he's had going on in his head to try to basically bring Absalom kind of back into the fold here. And what we get for the next several verses is we get the most detailed conversation, the longest and most detailed conversation of any that you see between 1st and 2nd Samuel. Most of when we're reading these books, we're seeing lots of different snapshots that have been put together. here. But this is one of the rare times that we actually get the details of a conversation going on here. But anyway, we see that Joab enlists this wise woman. He gives her an outline, So I mean, again, when we read through this, we can see that there are certain things he's telling her to say, and there's other things that he's telling her not to say, and then he's just trusting that this woman has enough finesse with the words to pull this ploy off here. And so here we go. It says, when the words, or when the woman of Tekoa came to the king, she fell on her face to the ground and paid homage and said, "Save me, O king." Well, first, Joab, he had the pull to make sure this lady came before the king. And what's fascinating with these words, I mean, she comes respectfully. She comes in and she bows down on the ground before him, and she says, "Save me, O king." When these words are translated out of Hebrew into Greek, we get a word that says Hosanna. So obviously something we've all heard before. Sometimes "Save me, O king" is translated "Give salvation now." So Hosanna. And the king said to her, "What is your trouble?" She answered, "Alas, I am a widow. My husband is dead, and your servant had 2 sons, and they quarreled with one another in the field. There was no one to separate them, and one struck the other and killed him. And now the whole clan has risen up against your servant, and they say, 'Give up the man who struck his brother, that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed.' And so they would destroy the heir also. They would quench my coal that is left, and leave to my husband neither name nor remnant on the face of the earth." Wow, so she presents a very interesting situation here. She's coming to the king because she needs help with being delivered from a tough situation. Her husband was dead, and the 2 sons got into a quarrel. And part of the tricky part in this is you can argue that God's law required that this leftover son be killed. Exodus 21:12 says, "Whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death." But then the next verse in Exodus makes a distinction. It kind of makes a distinction between murder and manslaughter. And it says, "But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee." So there was a point in Exodus where they sometimes had what were called sanctuary cities, that people could go to. And when she's bringing up this story here, she's basically pointing out that the death was not a premeditated murder, that the immediate family, was really not interested in the justice that the rest of the clan was seeking out. And so she was pleading for compassion for her one remaining burning coal. You love the Hebrew language, the way they state things here. And she also points out that since there would be no remnant for her husband, that her husband's name and posterity would be completely wiped out here. So this lady had carefully delivered this tale, and it's kind of similar to what Nathan did back in chapter 12. Nathan gave a story or a scenario here with this. And so she presents the story, and then it says in verse 8, "Then the king said to the woman, Go to your house, and I will give orders concerning you. Wow. So it sounds like David is probably listening to several cases being brought before him. But, and this was probably kind of his standard routine, was to hear the case and then to later give his official warning or his official ruling. But this lady, again, she was seeking David's intervention on this matter. She was pressing David to give an answer. And so she comes in and she states, "On me be the guilt, my lord the king, and on my father's house. Let the king and his throne be guiltless." And so here she's just jumping in and saying, King David, if I've omitted anything from this story that's going to affect your ruling, the fault falls on me, not you. But she's obviously pressing to get an answer. And then David said, "If anyone says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall never touch you again." There. Then she said, "Please let the king invoke the Lord your God, that the avenger of blood kill no more, and my son not be destroyed." He said, "As the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground." All right. So David is given a ruling here. And he's given a ruling basically saying that he's going to let this son be forgiven, and that her son's going to be okay. And then this woman gets amazingly bold, because basically when David is giving this ruling, it's basically, I've said my bit, I've said what I'm going to say, move on. And I don't know if you've ever been in the position of kind of being in the presence of an authority figure, and then having to step up and do something when you've been told, your time is finished. Right after I finished high school, I ended up starting flying lessons. And in flying lessons, you've got an instructor who's training you, and then the instructor has a senior instructor that you check out with from time to time, because he's basically checking out that the other guy's, teaching me what I was supposed to know. And this was back in 1980, and so not surprisingly, my senior instructor was an old World War II pilot. I mean, good old Sam. And Sam probably had, somewhere around 15,000 hours flying time. I had 19 hours of flying time. Sam had, at least 15,000. And we would go out and do our thing. And then Sam liked to show off. I remember one previous time, we go flying and he's doing these fancy kind of stalls called hammerhead stalls. And so he's just having fun, kind of showing off what he can do. But this particular day, he told me, he says, he says, "We can land the plane without using the stick." And I'm like, "We can." And so he had told me, hands off. And so hands off meant hands in my lap, feet away from the rudder pedals. I'm just watching. And so Sam is flying and he's hitting the rudder pedals hard. He's, going real hard with the throttle, different things he can do. And there's something called trim that can affect the elevator on the back. Anyway, he's doing all these things he can do to maneuver the plane without using the stick. And sure enough, he lines that plane up beautifully with the runway. And this is a plane with the nose wheel. And so obviously you land, with the nose flared up a little bit. But we're coming down. And I'm sitting there watching this, and we're coming down, and that nose is down. The nose is down. And we're getting amazingly close to the runway, and the nose is still down. And at the last minute, I grab the stick and pull it all the way back. and we still just barely hit nose first and land the plane. And so he lands the plane. We're taxiing back to the hangar. The whole time he's just staying quiet, and I'm not saying anything either. And we finally park the plane, and as we're out walking into the little school building, he looks at me and says, and he didn't use these exact terms, but he says, well, he said, you pulled me out of my lousy landing, didn't you? And I just responded, I pulled me out of your lousy landing. And so, every now and then you just got to be bold. One of the things to keep in mind with this lady is that Joab had given her a purpose to be there, and at this point in time, she had kind of presented part one, but the main reason she's going there, she's got to be able to get that in. And so, verse 12, the woman said, please let your servant speak a word to the Lord my king. And he said, speak. So obviously the way this lady was able to give her story and plead with them made an impression with David, just as Joab hoped it would do. And so now we get the next words. Why have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in given this decision, the king convicts himself, inasmuch as the king does not bring his banished one home again. Wow. And so she goes from pleading to get mercy to where she jumps in with an amazingly strong accusation here. And, and gosh, the first part of this, why have you then planned such a thing against the people of God? That's an amazingly bold statement there. And so basically she is inferring to David that he had done something similar to the wrong that he had just corrected for her. But she adds this extra punch to it that, King, you've done this against the people of God. Like I said, this is an amazingly brave lady. And then as soon as she makes this statement, she quickly turns back into her ruse of being a troubled widow and kind of hides behind it. And David pretty quickly picks up on what's going on here. It doesn't take David very long to figure out who's really behind all this. And then it says in verse 18, David said, do not hide from me anything I ask you. And the woman said, let the Lord my king speak. The king said, is the hand of Joab with you in all this? So obviously Joab had brought this up before and before, and as this is playing out, David is seeing that Joab is doing this. And so basically the lady admits, yes, Joab has done this. And so here we go from this clever scheme into now we get David answering Joab. And, unfortunately, David returns back with the scheme of his own. David says, behold now, I grant this. Go back. He says, go, bring back the young man Absalom. And Joab fell on his face to the ground and paid homage and blessed the king. And Joab said, today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight, my lord the king, in that the king has granted the request of his servant. And so Joab arose and went to Gishar and brought Absalom back to Jerusalem. And the king said, and this is what David said, this is his scheme now. He says, let him dwell apart in his own house, for he is not to come into my presence. So Absalom lived apart in his own house and did not come into the king's presence. Sometimes this is translated where David says he is not to come into my presence. Sometimes translated as he cannot see my face. So David kind of half-wittingly gives in. So instead of being banished in Geshar, now he's just banished at a shorter distance. Absalom's been brought in. And so this next part picks up where Absalom has now been in Jerusalem for 2 years without seeing David. One of the tricky things here is that Absalom is ready to face David, and so he reaches out to Joab. Joab went to the trouble of doing all this, bringing him here, but apparently Joab was very frustrated that David didn't go any further. So Joab reaches out a couple of times. Absalom reaches out to Joab a couple of times, and Joab just totally ignores him, and it's not going to have anything to do with it. So Absalom decides to get his attention. He sets his field on fire, and so that obviously got Joab to approach Absalom, and then Absalom basically says, "Behold, I sent word to you. Come here that I may send you to the king to ask, why have I come from Geshar? It would be better for me to still be there. Now, therefore, let me go into the presence of the king, and if there is guilt in me, let him put me to death." Then Joab went to the king and told him, and he summoned Absalom. Now, very bold statement. That is, if there is guilt in me, let the king put me to death. Well, I think Absalom pretty well knew he wasn't going to be put to death. He'd been there for 2 years, and David hadn't acted on it. And so anyway, it says that he came to the king and bowed himself on the face to the ground before David. And the king kissed Absalom. Now, the frustration with this is we don't see anything about David forgiving Absalom. We don't see anything of reconciliation. It's just he came and he kissed him. Chapter 15. Chapter 15 is just like the ultimate in politics here. And gosh, we've got our own political season charging up now. But we quickly see that a couple of things, that Absalom knew how to work a crowd, and Absalom was not lazy. So it says, after this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" And when he said, "Your servant is of such and such a tribe in Israel," Absalom would say to him, "See, your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you." Then Absalom would say, "Oh, that I were judge in the land, then every man with the dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice." And whenever a man came near to pay homage to him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. Thus Absalom did to all of Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. So, wow. So Absalom knew how to present himself. He had his chariot and his horses. And so he made sure he was getting attention. And then he had his group of 50 men to go before him. And so it sounds like a lot of these men were ones basically scouting out these people that Absalom would speak with. Psalms 27 was written by David, and it makes you wonder if he was thinking about this period of time, because it says, "Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God." Now, there. But one of the things that's interesting is, Absalom's listening to these cases, and just in kind of, theatrical things, he's just telling these people about, oh, you were so right. If it was up to me, this case would be settled. And one of the tricky things here is that when it came to the hard and unpopular cases, all Absalom had to do was just act like he would deal with it. He never actually had to deal with anything. He just had to pretend like he would act with it. And so this stealing of the hearts of the people, obviously is just this deception. It's not necessarily affection, but he was putting things into place. Anyway, talking about how patient Absalom is, it says, at the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Please let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebron. For your servant vowed a vow while I lived in Gishar, saying, if the Lord will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will offer worship to the Lord." The king said to him, "Go in peace." So he arose and went to Hebron. Absalom, again, had been working on this upcoming move for 4 years. So he had made lots of connections over time. And one of the things that's kind of interesting here is, he's using the religious reason to want to go back to Hebron. Hebron is where David was originally anointed king. So, that's an important city there. And this is the last time that David and Absalom speak face to face. And so David's last words to his son face to face were, "Go in peace." So obviously this is catching David off guard. And so Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, Absalom is king at Hebron." With Absalom went 200 men from Jerusalem who were invited guests, and they went in their innocence and knew nothing. And while Absalom was offering sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel, the Gileonite, David's counselor from the city of Gilo. And the conspiracy grew, and the people with Absalom kept increasing. One of the things here that's interesting, that this is the first we hear of this guy, Ahithophel. But as we go on and read, we see that he was an extremely important political advisor for David. And it's, and you can kind of already tell here that Ahithophel is already involved with Absalom. In fact, as you kind of think through this, Ahithophel is probably one of the primary people guiding Absalom and how to carry out this coup that's going on. And so, then comes the question of why would Ahithophel, one of David's most trusted and high advisors, be helping out Absalom? And for those people out there that like to chase down the genealogies that you come across here, uh, more power to you. But we read that Bathsheba's father's name was Elam. There's another genealogy in here that points out that Ahithophel had a son named Elam. And so it's not 100%, but there's a strong possibility that Bathsheba was Ahithophel's granddaughter, And so if Absalom knew that, he pretty much knew he had easy pickings in getting Ahithophel to play along with them here. One of the things here too is that with all the connections that Absalom was making, he had 200, people come along that were clueless as to what was going to take place. He had this huge crowd to follow him in. One thing this reminds me of, gosh, sorry, going back to my high school days. When I was a senior in high school, that was at the time that the Iran crisis broke out. And I went to a big high school in Montgomery. Robert E. Lee, go Generals, yes. Got a few fellow graduates with me here. But anyway, we had to take this mandatory government class. And in my government class, of all things, we had an exchange student from Iran in the government class while all this was taking place. And I remember, when you watched the news at that time, you would sometimes see the news show these throngs of people, yelling and screaming and carrying on. And somebody in our class asked, his name was Jamshid, asked Jamshid about that. And Jamshid pointed out, he said, these people really do not understand what all is going on. Somebody has said, hey, listen, there's news cameras at the end of the street. Let's go down. We'll be on TV. And so you had these throngs of people going in and screaming and yelling. And, and really and truly, a lot of them, I mean, even there weren't really appreciating what all was going on. And so you kind of see a similar thing going on here in that Absalom has dragged on a big throng of innocent people to just incite the excitement and get things going. And so verse 13, it said, and a messenger came to David saying, the hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom. Then David said to all of his servants who were with him in Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, or else there will be no escape for us from Absalom. Go quickly, lest he overtake us quickly and bring down ruin on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword. And so David quickly sees how things are being played out. And David's been a king, I think, roughly 20 years. And David's no idiot. And so David is quickly putting things in order, one, so that he won't get killed. And as the rest of this chapter plays out, David is he's going into defense mode. David's good at defense mode. After all those years of being tracked by Saul, and this is like a chess game. David's got to put his pieces in the right place so that he can keep going on. And I hope the handout got spread out there, but I'm just going to kind of go over some of these key people because they become important in the next chapters. David is now putting this team together. Now, one of the things it says says, so the king went out and all of his household after him, and the king left 10 concubines to keep the house. All right, so 10 concubines stayed behind. Probably some of this is David was hoping to come back. And so when he came back, he would at least want his home that he would come back into to be in some kind of order. So he left them there. But as they're moving out, it points out that in verse 23 that they crossed the brook Kidron, or the Kidron Valley. And then from the Kidron Valley, as they're leaving Jerusalem, they're ascending up the Mount of Olives. Something that's interesting there is 1,000 years later, a son of David walks away from Jerusalem, and he walks through the Kidron Valley. And then he goes up to the Mount of Olives. And next to the Mount of Olives is the Garden of Gethsemane. And so this is some kind of just fascinating imagery there that of direction, of just direction and leaving Jerusalem there. But David at one point strategically stops, and he's watching all these people. I mean, there's probably hundreds and probably thousands of people that are following him out. And he's looking at who's coming through. And, obviously, and what's happening, David doesn't want any spies of Absalom being there. And so he sees this guy, Attai the Gittite. And David said to him, "Why do you also go with us? Go back and stay with the king, for you are a foreigner and also an exile from your home. You came only yesterday, and shall I today make you wander about with us, since I go I know not where? Go back and take your brothers with you, and may the Lord show you steadfast love and faithfulness to you." But Attai answered him, "As the Lord lives, and as the Lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king shall be, whether for death or for life, there also will your servant be." And David said to Attai the Gittite, "Go, then pass on." And so it said that him with all of his men and his little ones, or his children, were with him. So this guy showed some allegiance, that not just he went with them, but he brought his family with him as well. But you see David scouting out these people. And it turns out that Attai the Gittite ends up becoming an important leader in his army in a future chapter here. So we see David, basically working the chess game there. Then we also see where some of the priests were on board with David, and they were following him. And there was one called Abiathar and Zadok, and they decided to follow David, and they decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant with them. And David said no. He said, carry the Ark of God back into the city. And then he points out to the priest, that he basically wants them to stay there, and he wants their sons to be messengers, so that when they find out any information, these can be people who bring information back to him. Again, chess moves. And then it's about this time where finally David is told about Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And, David is being uprooted. He's being run out of his home. And probably one of the worst things he could hear is that Ahithophel has decided to conspire against him. And so David says, "Oh Lord, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." And then about this time, David sees a guy named Hushai the Archite. This was a gentleman who was probably elderly. And he said, "If you go on with me, you will be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, 'I will be your servant, O king, as I have been your father's servant in times past, so now I will be your servant,' he said, 'then you will defeat for me the counsel of Ahithophel.'" It mentions that Hushai is the Archite. The Archites were probably within the Benjamite family that Absalom was a part of. And so that probably made it a little easier for him to hang around and be there and take on that place. But anyway, probably the most important verses we see in chapter 15 come back to where David humbles himself, and he humbles himself before God. And we see it in verses 25 and 26. When he's telling them, the priest, to carry the ark back into the city, he said, if I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and let me see both it and the dwelling place. But if he says, I have no pleasure in you, behold, here I am, let him do to me what seems good to him. So we see this amazing bit of humility where David, with all the horrible things going on, his heart is seeking to just do whatever God wants to take place. Anyway, yeah, rich chapters here. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this, for your word, and for a chance to dig deep into these chapters. And Lord, just guide us. When our troubles come, guide us through the Kidron Valley and to the Mount of Olives. And Lord, just let us always fall into your arms. In your precious name, amen. Yeah. Oh, yeah. All right. Thanks.